What's up, guys? It's chapter 18, The Victorian Make the Modern, 1880 to 1917. We'll look at commerce and culture. First, look at entertainment, then look at social inequalities and the great outdoors. We'll continue to look at social reform, in particular women's movement, also African Americans. And we'll also have a new form of social reform with religion and the arts as well. So right off the top, entertainment. So there was a new culture which was abandoning the Victorian style etiquette and morals. This was more of a fun, noble culture in an American culture. Industrialization allowed for working class Americans to afford new goods, services, but also entertainment. In this particular case, we see P.T. Barnum's circus, which was one such form of entertainment that appealed to Americans and Europeans of all classes. This became known as the P.T. Barnum Circus. It made P.T. Barnum a rich man. He promoted the circus as a family fun that would help kids be brave and become physically active. He showed captivated audience as he displayed the majestics and the eccentric. In this particular case, the jumbo, the elephant, and you notice the people being in awe because of something so majestic. But it was not limited to animals. He also displayed people in their unique or eccentric talents. So here we have the Congo giant. Over here we have the bearded lady. And down here we have the smallest men living. So people with unconventional qualities and physical appearance were also part of the circus. And they're here. You see a couple other ones as well in the forefront. So that was one form of entertainment, but it wasn't the only one. It was just a start. The YMCA, which was established in Boston in 1851, combined Christian values with physical training. The Y, as it became known, sought to make young men clean and strong, not only physical but also spiritually. These young men would become strong, disciplined men, ready to work in industries and follow orders. Now, one way to do this was through competition. Competing in sports would then allow working men to compete for the best product and against rival companies. So here we see the men that are learning. So this was also a mental form of training and education. The physical we see here. So to help young men stay physically active year-round, winter sports like basketball, as you see here, and volleyball were introduced in the late 1880s. Women were then allowed to join sports like these, but to resort to their physical dominance, men resorted to more violent sports like boxing, weightlifting, and martial arts. Sports were creating an outgoing culture as well, but it maintained that male-dominant society. So here, initially, you threw the ball, or the basketball, into a basket, and then you had to retrieve it. Now, you throw the basketball through the basket. So basketball was introduced in the late 1880s. Baseball actually became popular during the Civil War as an activity to, quote, pass the time, unquote. As such, baseball becomes known as America's pastime. Initially, baseball was actually played by the working class, but it became a symbol of social classes and ethnic prejudice, as only later on the middle class and white-collar workers had the time to play and the income to afford equipment. So the working class were actually kind of left out. The National League, which you see here, was established in 1876 with 12 teams. These teams were set up to face each other, and it pleased fans. Fans then became consumers because business leaders saw baseball as a business from which to make profit. You see the 12 teams here of the National League as well. But the World Series was not going to be played for another nearly 30 years. We see business leaders that realize that playing sports foster cooperation, teamwork, competition, and an opportunity to advertise their product. The first World Series was actually won by the Boston Americans, who defeated the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1903. However, baseball stadiums were sites of racial discrimination and segregation. Teams denied African Americans the opportunity to play for them or change their players' identity to please the crowds. Therefore, African Americans started their own teams and played in different fields. These again are the 12 captains of the 12 original teams. They actually become known as heroes to some people. So sports was actually a place where the poor white men could look up to and possibly see hope that they could become part of their America's pastimes. So since African Americans were banned, for the most part, playing in white league baseball, they created their own league, which became known as the Negro League, which you see up here. Baseball did provide African Americans an opportunity to show that their skills and talents were just as good, if not better, than whites. However, baseball, like most sports, remained segregated for the next 50 years until Jackie Robinson was brought up by Branch Rickey from the Brooklyn Dodgers, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, to play for the white Brooklyn Dodgers on April 15, 1947. But the Negro League was established in the early 1800s. You see this man? We'll come back to him a little bit later. He is Booker T. Washington, very influential African American. Next sport that we're going to be talking about is football. Football actually started as a collegiate sport, not a professional sport. You see here there's minimal padding and there was minimal rules. As such, accidents and deaths occurred. By 1908, new rules sought to limit injuries and eliminate days from the playing fields. Like baseball, football became a business. The first game between Yale and Harvard was attended by over 50,000 fans. Each fan had to purchase a ticket, and there you see the economic benefits. The first professional team was actually not organized until Carnegie Steel organized it in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and business leaders used sports to divert workers from labor unions and occupy them in physical activities. So we see a collaboration between sports and business activities. Now, most of this entertainment, as you saw, pleased men. However, there was white middle-class women who also seek entertainment. And this is where the department stores play a big role. This was a one-stop shop for all goods and services. So you see here actually different types of opportunities: clothing, you see produce, you see meat, the dentist, banks, and even legal advice. This was considered family fun because everything said, "I'll meet you at the fountain," so everybody knew that you meant the department stores. Well, probably we would call it the malls today. Now, this was a form of pseudo-democracy, because it was meant that all people from all classes were able to visit department stores, but not all were welcome in stores, or had the means to purchase the items that they themselves possibly produced at the factory. Working class women actually worked long hours, standing up all day, dealing with difficult customers. Class status were clearly visible in department stores. Middle class women were lured by tea rooms, children's play areas, wrap and carry purchases, and credit, while the working class women worked as clerks and cashiers and attendants. So you did see both of them, but the working class women were unable to afford the goods that they themselves were selling. A lot of times, the only way to try on the different goods that the company was selling was by actually trying it on there and showing it for the customers that were coming in. Technology was actually used as a social class, another method to differentiate classes. The elite had electricity that Edison provided, washing machines, vacuums, and telephones. This chart here tells us three different communities. Palo Alto was an affluent elitist community, San Rafael was a middle-class community, and Antioch was a poor working community. The chart tells us the amount of people that had telephones for every 1,000 residents between 1900 and 1940. So the Palo Alto community, the more affluent community, there was more people who had telephones than the middle class, and definitely more than the poor class. So technology was also a method to differentiate yourself as different classes. Elite women, for example, were able to use a phone to communicate with each other at home, while working class women worked as telephone operators. Railroads were yet another symbol of social status. Pullman railroads offer the same comforts and rail cars as those at home, including cradles for infants. Pullman cars were fitted with rich carpets, as you can see here, upholstery, down here, and woodworking up here in the roof. In this particular picture, you see that all passengers are whites, while the porter, or the servant, is an African American. Now, porters were one of the better respected jobs that African Americans could have, and better paying jobs for African Americans. But few African Americans were able to ride on these trains without being discriminated. One such example was Homer Plessy, in what becomes known as the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. You definitely need to know this case. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Homer Plessy was an African American who was riding on a first-class car in the southern state of Louisiana. Now, he had paid for his seat and was sitting amongst whites, but was asked to move to the, quote, colored, unquote, cars. He refused because he had paid for the seat that he was in, and as such was arrested. The Supreme Court eventually ruled that separate facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment clause of equal protection so long as those facilities were equal. So what becomes known as a separate but equal law or clause laid the foundation for more segregated laws, like what becomes known as the Jim Crow laws, and you see it depicted in this political cartoon. Jim Crow laws dominated racial issues in the South for the next 70 years. Jim Crow laws applied to schools, park, hotels, restaurants, streetcars, trains, sports, movie theaters. Now, these facilities were supposed to be equal, but again, as depicted in these two political cartoons, the drinking faucet for the whites, drinking faucet for the blacks, the white car, the Jim Crow train. These facilities were grotesquely unequal and constantly reminded African Americans of their inferiority. So we see that modernity, industrialization, while it was economic progress, it did not necessarily mean social progress. I would argue, on the contrary, it meant social discrimination and segregation. One of the few places where equality was more of a balance were national parks and forests. After Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872, depicted here, more states and national officials set aside public land for preservation. You notice most of them are in the west coast of the United States. Environmentalists worked to protect wildlife and were successful in passing the Lacey Act in 1900. Lacey Act, L-A-C-E-Y, Act, A-C-T. The Lacey Act established federal penalties for selling specified birds, animals, and plants. Furthermore, in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt, who was an avid outdoorsman, passed the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act, which enabled the U.S. president to set aside objects of historic and scientific interest as national monuments. 2 years later, in 1908, Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act to preserve over 800,000 acres of the Arizona Grand Canyon, right there. If you guys have ever seen the Grand Canyon, it is a majestic place to visit. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson established the National Park Service for preserving and protecting national parks. So these great outdoors activities, what they become known, actually blur social lines, as rich and poor camped on the grounds and hiked the same trails. The great outdoors also encourage physical activities by enjoying nature's beauty. So people, part of the culture, became more of an outdoors people. One of the most influential people that you need to know, environmentalist, was John Muir, a botanist. He was instrumental in pushing for legislation to make Yosemite a national park. Congress approved Yosemite to become a national park in 1890. 2 years later, in 1892, Muir founded the Sierra Club to preserve and enjoy America's great mountains. Since its foundation, the Sierra Club has helped with preservation, conservation, and getting children to love the great outdoors. And that is John Muir. And this is most likely Yosemite National Park. And you see, this kind of shows some form of reality. And we'll come back and talk about realism in the arts. Education. So education was key to upward mobility. Civil War parents encouraged their daughters to get an education, as they had seen the plight of widows and orphans because of the war. Girls were encouraged to prepare themselves for teaching or office jobs, work before marriage, and gain skills that they could fall on just in case their man died or women were left alone. And girls listened to their parents. They listened to this advice. You see the chart up here. More females actually enrolled and graduated high school in 1870. Out of the 16,000 high schoolers, 9,000 of them were women. By 1910, out of the 156,000 high school graduates, 93,000 were women. So they will see an increase in women's education. But it didn't stop there. College enrollment for women actually increased. This here is a picture of Radcliffe College. You see all these females who are now college graduate. Very, very huge accomplishment. These colleges offer subjects such as bookkeeping, typewriting, and shorthand. But as female education was not widely accepted, doctors actually argued that education would unsex, I'm not sure what that means, but unsex young women and drain energy from their ovaries, leading them to bear weak children. As these claims actually were denied because of women's achievements, not only in the workplace but also at home, more and more women were encouraged to receive an education. And this education becomes instrumental in the reform movements that they launched in the late 1800s.